Hi everyone, and welcome to the Mimic Productions CLO 3D webinar. I will be speaking on behalf of Mimic Productions to tell you a little bit about our company, what we do, and how our work translates into CLO 3D. Mimic Productions was founded in 2012, and we are known for our highly realistic 3D avatars. Although this is what we specialize in, we also do a full character pipeline, which includes scanning, motion capture, rigging, animation, and so on. We are based in Berlin and have quite an international team of artists and technicians, and are lucky enough to also have our studio in a historical building in Wedding, Berlin. Although the quality of our avatars are at this film level and have often been used for film use cases, we have worked very hard in the past years to translate this quality into real-time use cases. As more and more industries and artists, individuals become interested in using 3D avatars or 3D in general, it's very important that our characters can work in these real-time use cases, not only for rendering, but also live performances. And this has been quite a focus for our team in the past years. Mimic has also taken advantage of working with CLO 3D for a range of projects in various industries, not just fashion, but also gaming, advertising, and even for virtual influencers. We get quite a high quality simulation result, which is on par with our characters and works really well in the final product. Some examples where we have used CLO 3D was for Emma Raducanu for a Vodafone advertisement at Piccadilly Square. We also worked on a campaign for Burberry featuring Naomi Campbell, a campaign for Marco Polo, and most recently we've been creating garments for retail spaces in the metaverse. What makes Mimic's avatar special? We specialize in creating highly realistic avatars, and preferably for multiple use cases. Also, in recent years, we've been tasked with bringing that realism and functionality into CLO 3D. Although our goal is to achieve realism, it's also to ensure that these assets will translate into various platforms. We work to not only focus on the modeling and texturing, but also the integration and shading of these assets. This is just to make sure that they can work across the board and that our clients have a bit more freedom with the assets. We've also worked to improve body deformations. In our animation and rigging workflow, we often like to use Maya as kind of our main point to bring in these more realistic deformations in key areas like the elbows, knees, and hips, so that this animation can be baked down and applied into CLO, as you saw in the video. We've also worked to try to optimize these rigs so they work more directly in viewports of programs such as CLO, so that designers or individuals designing garments can see this directly in their viewport in real time, rather than having to go through baking poses or animation. We've also worked to introduce specialized blend shapes to our rigs to help prevent issues of body-on-body collision when the avatar is being posed or animated. Often, in areas like underneath the armpit, the arm will touch, the upper side, and this can definitely create a simulation that is not so realistic and can cause snagging, clipping, or pulling. And we've worked to add these specialized blend shapes to ensure that the cloth is simulating as best as it can, as it would in real time, and sits more naturally in these key areas. We also work, as mentioned previously, to make sure that these assets are versatile, that the same assets or base set of assets that we would give you could go into not only a real-time engine, but could also be used in an offline rendering use case or CLO 3D. It's very important to us, especially the way the industry is developing, to ensure that our assets are versatile and can be used in multiple different ways. And now that we've gone through a little bit about Mimic, what we do, what makes our character special, how we've utilized CLO, and how we've even adapted our characters to work better in CLO. I would now like to take you through a little bit about our pipeline and a technical walkthrough of how we would prepare one of our characters for CLO, how we would set them up, taking them from Maya into CLO up to the point of simulation. So we'll start off with the avatar introduction. We'll go through a little of our general avatar setup, preferred poly counts, rig, and texture maps. So for the avatar setup video you see here, we're showing a standard joint-only skeleton hierarchy that we use. This will also go into the different geo groups. We, of course, first have our head and body geo, which you can see here. And then, of course, we have our eye geo group, which for us normally consists of lashes, lacrimal wetness, and the eyeball. And then, of course, we have our geo group for the hair. And something you don't see in this video, but it was included in the head and body geo, was the teeth and mouth bag, which is a standard that's included with our avatars as well. Even if, you know, the character isn't really intended to have a facial rig upon its conception, we always include this just in case it would need it down the road. And it also is much better having that in place for general facial structure development throughout the production process. For the poly count, we often like to have a character between 70 to 80K vertices for the head and body. Of course, we have an additional number below, which is including the IGOs. This has been quite successful for us going across different platforms and still maintaining a realistic look of the character. Of course, we are always able to offer another kind of LOD option for the character if this is too high, but often for us this is a nice sweet spot in terms of the poly count to maintain that realism across different types of engines and programs. And for the rig, we have here the our kind of standard rig setup. This video is kind of taking you through examples of how the correctives spoken about previously work to help correct key areas like the shoulders, knees, and hips. This rig in particular is a combination of both corrective joints and blend shapes, and depending on what your final animation format needs would be, you would kind of maybe make a decision when going into clothes whether you want to stick with corrective blend shapes or joints. If you're more interested in seeing these deformations looking nice in the viewport of clo, you might maybe lean more towards corrective joints, whereas if you are going to bake down animation, you could definitely have a mix or corrective blend shapes. And this is here, you know, was a nice example of showing how that hip deformation is getting corrected. And here we're switching over to the control rig version of the the HIK control rig, and just how you could work with it this way in Maya when you switch over that way. Of course, you know, once you have your rig established and have your character in Maya, before we would go into the next steps of bringing this character into Clo, we would want to make sure that we also have our material IDs applied, and this would go for any engine or program. And we would basically, like in the video, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward setup. We just open up the hypershade, which is where we're selecting these materials and applying what we need to for the different maps that get applied to the head or body. And having this set up is always an important step. It allows us to see the diffuse, you know, when you bring the character into Clo. Of course, you have to set up the remaining maps in the shader manually once you get into Clo, but having this done on the rig before you go into the next steps is important. And then lastly, we have our texture maps. So the texture maps that we would normally use for CLO 3D would, for the body and head, would be a diffuse that is combined with an ambient occlusion. So this would be one map, these two combined together, along with a roughness, normal, and thickness map. And this is our standard setup for characters going into CLO. And although we normally create these at 4K, we do like to make sure that they are available in 2K and 1K as well if we have clients that are going to be working primarily in CLO, because it's always nice to have a bit more flexibility with the weight of the scene by being able to maybe take a lower resolution set of maps and being able to kind of pick and choose that way. It is worth noting that the hair maps we use are a slightly different selection of maps, as one could imagine, and for that setup, it's normally an alpha, diffuse, roughness, opacity, and normal. We've had pretty good results with hair using those standard set of maps. And yeah, this is our kind of base approach there. And outside of the changes in resolution, we pretty much are able to use these same maps across the board. Of course, we combined the diffuse and the ambient occlusion map together, and normally for Unreal or something you would not do this, but generally these are all coming from the same source map, so they are still versatile. Now that we've gone over our general avatar setup, our rig, our texture maps, and essentially all the elements that make up one of our characters, the next step would be talking about how we prepare that avatar and the animations for exporting and bringing into CLO, and the integration process that we go through when taking one of our characters into CLO and the adjustments we make to get them at the realism or the look that we would like. So one of our first steps, once we have the rig established and the animation or pose ready, would be to first double check this in Maya, make sure that everything is as it should be. This would also be the time that we would, look at the character and see if one of these special blend shapes that we've developed may be needed for better simulation. In this case, it might be nice to have our armpit blend shape applied to prevent any issues with the garment simulation in that area. As mentioned in previous slides, sometimes when the body collides with itself, that can cause snagging or pulling during the simulation process. So in this case, having that activated could help. And we can see that the animation is still working okay with that blend shape applied. There's no issues. And this animation would be considered ready to go. In this case, because it is an animation, we would export it and use it as an FBX. And in this video, we have a pose. So we would go through the same steps that we did with the animation, making sure that our blend shape is applied and that the pose is looking as it should. And then we would go through our exporting process. For us, when we go to export, we would first go to select the hierarchy and bake in this case, baking the joints and blend shapes for the pose so that this can be exported properly. And this would also be the same case for an animation. But for an animation, we would then export this as an FBX. And in this case, for the pose, we'll treat this a little differently once we bring it into CLO. We do want to make sure that once we have baked the joints and blend shapes, that we do delete the control and rig groups in the character group and select the Raven character groups in the outliner. From there, you can go and export your selection into FBX format. And once we've exported everything that we think we will need to bring into CLO, the first step is going to be bringing our character into CLO and making any of the needed adjustments there and saving this character out as an AVT. So once we bring our character in, we should have the diffuse visible. You'll see that there's a few issues with the hair and the eyes, which we will correct. And we also want to get a few more details in there. So we're first going to start off by selecting and applying the skin material to the body and face material IDs. And one of the first maps that we'll go in and add is the normal map. And once we get that into the slot, we will set that at 100. Once we've completed that step, we'll go into the roughness and inputting this to map instead of intensity, and applying the roughness map into the slot and changing that intensity to 55. Once we have our roughness map in, we would then want to bring in the thickness map, and we would put this into all three color maps for the subsurface scattering. Once we've completed this, we do want to go in and address these eye geos. Because they are fully transparent, we want to turn those off and just leave the eyelashes and eyeball geometry visible. Once we've hidden those, we do want to go in and change the eye roughness and put that at 0 and the reflection at 100. So we get this glossy effect to still get a feeling that the eyeball itself does have that wetness there and is a bit more reflective. And once we've adjusted the eyes, we want to go in on the hair. We'll change the opacity mode to RGB. And then we, of course, want to go in and adjust the roughness, specular and normal, similar to what we did for the skin materials. For the reflection intensity, we will put that at 45. And of course, for the normal, we will put this at 100 as well. And that's our general avatar setup. From this point, we would go through and double check that we're happy with everything and see if there's any other additional updates that we would want to integrate for this character, or apply to the character, I should say. And one thing that we do like to do is actually multiply our AO on the diffuse. And we do this just to give a bit more shadow and feeling of depth on the character. It isn't a massive change, but it can really help in certain areas where you want to get a bit more depth, particularly around the eyes, ears, face. In this example that you're looking at, you'll see, I think the most obvious place that you can see it is underneath the armpits. You definitely get a sense of that shadow there, whereas on the right side, it's definitely not as visible. And this is a nice technique that we like to add to get just a little bit more depth and realism on the characters directly in the viewport. And once we've applied these adjustments, we're happy with our shaders. This would be the time where we would save this character out as an AVT. And this will basically save all of these settings we've just gone through and adjusted, so that when we bring the character in again as an AVT, we don't have to manually set this up anymore, and the character will be ready to go to have any animation or poses applied to it. And this would be the moment that we do go in and apply our pose. This is the character brought in as an AVT, and we'll apply the pose that we saved out earlier. And there we have it. And at this point, we've checked our pose. If we're happy with it and everything looks like it's acting the way it should, we would bring in any garments that we would want to simulate and go from there. And this would pretty much be the same approach for the animation. Of course, the animation is as an FBX. With our poses, as mentioned, we would bring them in as an FBX and always save them out pose file. This makes it a bit easier later for dragging and dropping different poses directly into CLO and getting that immediate result. But in this case, you would also bring in your FBX to apply your animation, and from there you would be able to simulate. And that concludes our general overview of not only a little bit about Mimic, but the characters we develop and how we optimize and integrate these characters for CLO. I hope that everyone had a good time listening in and that this was informative. We're definitely, it's a pleasure for us to be here. So big thanks to CLO for inviting us, and a big thanks to everyone for joining.